Hi, everyone. I'm Simon Cordery, Chair of the History Department at Iowa State University, and I'd like to thank Susan Gent and the library for allowing us to hold this series, which is now in its 5th year here at Ames Public Library. This is a fantastic way for us to give you a sense of what we do and also to get some questions and some comments and some conversations going that we don't normally get. So this is a really valuable public forum for what we think is the most valuable and important of disciplines, and that is the discipline of history. And it's my pleasure this evening to introduce a historian who is my colleague, Dr. David Hollander. David is a professor of history at Iowa State University, and he is also the director of the Classical Studies program. A multiple award-winning teacher, Dr. Hollander offers courses on Western civilization, classical Greece and Rome, and ancient empires. His scholarly work focuses on the economic history of late Republican and early Imperial Rome. He's the author of 2 books, Money in the Late Roman Republic and Farmers and Agriculture in the Roman Economy, and he's the co-editor in addition of 2 volumes of essays. He is also the general editor of the Encyclopedia of Ancient History, for which he has written on topics ranging from Roman Republican coinage and bullion to glue and insects. If you would like to see how Professor Hollander connects the distant past with our very real present, navigate on the web to a site called The Conversation. This is a website where academics write about our research in accessible ways. And last week, Professor Hollander published a very timely piece called Ancient Rome Successfully Fought Against Voter Intimidation, a Political Story Told with a Coin. Tonight, he's going to share with us another story with contemporary residents on imperial entrepreneurs. Dr. Hollander.
Thank you, Simon. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for coming here. And particular thanks to my colleagues, because this is a very busy week at the university, a lot going on. So I appreciate you making the effort to come out here. I didn't know this was the last of the history talks of this season. But I do want to mention, if you're looking for entertainment, maybe not entertainment, it might be a too strong a word. If you're looking for information at the library, my wife is giving a talk here on Thursday on something about property taxes. Contemporary, sure to be a little bit more useful than what I have to say. All right, so my topic, background information here. Iowa State, for as long as I can remember, has been encouraging everyone to be entrepreneurial. Students, certainly, but also faculty and presumably staff as well. My training is in Roman history, not entrepreneurship. So this talk is sort of my effort to meet the university halfway, as it continually tells me I need to be entrepreneurial. So were there entrepreneurs in antiquity? Begin with the basic question, what's an entrepreneur? My computer dictionary says it's a person who organizes and operates a business or businesses taking on greater than normal financial risks in order to do so, and entrepreneurial characterized by the taking of financial risks in the hope of profit, enterprising. A lot of risk there, but I am reassured by an extension article I found that this is not true, that entrepreneurs are risk averse, just like you and me. So were there Roman entrepreneurs? Yes, but I need to say that our evidence for them is not great. And the reason for that is the dominant ideology among the Romans was that basically any occupation other than farmer was degrading. And so the entrepreneurs are people that don't get a lot of attention in the surviving literature, unfortunately. Just to give you a sample of the attitude here, Cicero, noted orator and otherwise awful human being, remarks in his work De Officiis, Of all the occupations by which gain is secured, none is better than agriculture, none more profitable, none more delightful, none more becoming of a free man. And in fact, most other occupations are associated with slavery and anyway, very negative. Nevertheless, we do have a decent amount of information about Roman entrepreneurs, oftentimes coming, in fact, from Cicero himself. But before I get to that, I want to provide a little bit of context about the period I'm going to be discussing. So here we have the state of the Roman Empire around the year 290. Rome is at this point, 290 BC, I should say. Rome is at this point a regional power. It has taken firm control of central Italy, and it has primarily an agricultural economy. 90 years later, in 200 BC, the situation has changed rather dramatically. As you can see here, the purple areas indicating regions that Rome governs directly. And in fact, the empire's power stretches far beyond those purple areas. Rome is, by the year 200, the master of the Western Mediterranean. It has just defeated Hannibal and won the Second Punic War. But it is at this point financially exhausted. They've actually gone into debt to pay for the defeat of Hannibal, and they're having trouble in 200 at least, paying everything they want to pay for. Their situation is considerably improved if we move forward another 100 years. So here we have the situation in 100 BC. You can see their empire now expands further into the Iberian Peninsula, into the east, into Greece and Macedonia, Asia Minor, and many other places. Rome now dominates the entire Mediterranean. It has much greater public and private wealth than it had 100 or certainly 200 years before. They're so rich now that they've stopped taxing themselves. They just rely on the various income coming in from their provinces. In addition to not taxing themselves, they start to build larger and larger estates. They rely more and more heavily on slave labor, and they start building fancier villas, fancier houses in the city of Rome for themselves, and they put on fancy, expensive banquets. There's a lot going on in the 2nd century. At the same time, however, there is increasing political and social tension at Rome. Wealth has increased, but also inequality. Give you some examples of the tensions that are rising. Roman veterans have been increasingly drawn from poorer Roman citizens, and they would like to be rewarded for their service, particularly with land at the end of their terms. The Roman allies who have fought to win this empire with them increasingly want citizenship as one of their rewards for their service. The city of Rome has grown to, by this point, nearly 1 million inhabitants, unprecedented size. And many Romans, poorer Romans in Rome, are at the mercy of an extremely volatile market for food, particularly grain. They'd like subsidized grain. And there's also a lot of complaints about corruption at this point, bribery of voters, bribery of jurors, bribery everywhere, really, and corruption of provincial governors. So there's a lot going on, and it's not all positive. Some politicians do propose solutions. Other politicians fiercely oppose those proposed solutions, and the result is often violence in the streets of Rome. And several reforming politicians are in fact murdered along with their supporters in the late 2nd century. Now, it's around this time, so in and around the year 100, that we start to hear about a group of people known as negotiatores. So what's a negotiator? Well, so word stems from the Latin term negotium, which literally means the absence of leisure. or more conventionally, business. Essentially, negotiator is a Latin term for a businessman. In the late Republic, negotiatores were Romans and sometimes Italians who were basically managing private affairs beyond Italy. And Cicero, again, you see here, is a major source for our understanding of these negotiatores. And unfortunately, he uses the word really inconsistently. So it's a bit frustrating to get a sense of what the term actually means. So in one speech, he implies that negotiatores are different from coloni and from publicani and oratores and pecuari, so that there is some sort of distinct group that is Roman abroad, but not colonists, not the tax farmers, not the regular farmers, or the ranchers. But then at another place in the very same speech, he seems to indicate that negotiatores is a broad class that includes the publicani, the farmers, the ranchers, and so forth. And the same happens in another speech where we get a distinguishing between negotiatores and publicani, and then later between the negotiatores and various other groups. Sometimes it's clear negotiatores refers to kind of the whole Roman diaspora as a whole, but in other instances, it seems to be a rather narrow set of Romans and Italians who are engaged in some sort of business activity outside of Italy. We sometimes come across sort of cognate phrases for this. So, for example, in Greek texts, they're the Romans who are doing stuff, the Romans who are doing business. It's kind of the equivalent of negotiatores. And it's thought perhaps the vagueness of this term is due to the fact that some of these negotiatores are engaged in somewhat disreputable activities. Particularly, it's thought money lending. The Romans engage in lots and lots of money lending, but they tend to view it as not acceptable behavior, and you really want to keep distant from it if possible. At any rate, it seems pretty clear that negotiatores are essentially a kind of Roman entrepreneur. So where are they and what are they doing? Well, the term only begins to appear in texts dating to the early 1st century BC, but they probably emerged pretty early on as the Roman Empire expanded, at least expanded beyond Italy. Roman businessmen are active on the island of Delos, for example, by the middle of the 2nd century BC. And around that time, we find the merchants, actually a group of merchants from Beirut, honoring a Roman banker, a guy named Menatius, for his help to their association of worshippers of Poseidon. Now, he's not referred to as a negotiatore, but it seems like that's basically what he is. Turning to North Africa, a Roman historian named Sallust mentions that in the late 2nd century, there are a bunch of negotiatores at Utica, and that they were having trouble because of a war that broke out between the Romans and the Numidians around this time. We also hear of lots and lots of negotiatores operating on the island of Sicily, really throughout Sicily in the early 1st century BC. But again, they're probably there earlier. Cicero, again, notes their presence, particularly in the cities of Syracuse, Agrigentum, Lilybaeum, and Panormus. He also tells us that Gaul, modern France, was stuffed with negotiatores by the 70s BC. So they seem to be everywhere. And what are they doing? Well, they're acting as money lenders, they're acting as financiers, they're traders to some extent, and they also seem to be involved in developing land in these areas. one of the things that they're doing, almost certainly, is acting as agents, acting as intermediaries, taking money from wealthy Romans, particularly senators, and investing that money in the provinces, because that's something that senators couldn't do themselves. In fact, it was really illegal for a senator to engage in any sort of large scale trade. Again, thanks to Cicero, we know about a particular negotiator who was active on the island of Cyprus and had some dealings there. Cicero's private letters to his friend Atticus give us a more forthright description of some of the activities of these people. So one letter mentions, for example, that negotiatores were involved in a dispute over harbor taxes, suggesting that they were involved in trade. But a lot of the letters, well, several letters, mention this guy, Marcus Scaptius. Marcus Scaptius was, it turns out, an agent. He's called explicitly a negotiator. He's an agent, though, for Marcus Junius Brutus, soon to be assassin of Julius Caesar. And it turns out that through this Scaptius guy, Brutus has lent a sum of money to the community of Salamis on Cyprus, and he's trying to collect this loan at 48% annual interest. Cicero is, and I'm not a fan of Cicero. You may have noticed that already. He is rightly shocked at this and explains to his friend Atticus. He's a local provincial governor. Cicero tries to convince Scaptius to accept legal interest, which is considerably less than 48%. But we also learned that this guy had requested that Cicero make him a praefectus, an officer, basically, so he would have access to military forces that he could use to force the locals to pay their debt to him. Cicero says he's not going to do that. He is on principle never going to allow negotiatores to be officers. But other governors or other Roman governors were more accommodating. And so we hear that Scaptius, under a previous governor, had been appointed a praefectus and then had used cavalry to besiege the council house of Salamis, starving to death a number of councilmen in the process, all again part of his efforts to get this debt repaid. While I'm here, I just want to mention another thing that we know that these negotiatores do. They're able to transfer money throughout the Mediterranean without physically moving large quantities of coin from, say, Rome to Greece or vice versa. Basically, if you know the right negotiator, you can send them a letter and work out some sort of deal. They will advance money to you or a friend where they are, and in exchange, you will deposit money in an account for them back at Rome. So this is a very important service that they offer, and surely one that they also profit from. Because they're involved in things like besieging council houses and exploiting the territory of newly conquered provinces, negotiatores are not very popular. They're also sometimes operating on the very fringes of Roman power. So they're vulnerable to attacks from Rome's enemies and also resentful new subjects. Cicero tells us in one of his speeches that only in Sicily do the locals not hate negotiatores. Everywhere else they hate them. And he might be exaggerating there. At any rate, we hear that in North Africa, when Rome got into a war with the Numidians, the leader of the Numidians, a man named Jugurtha, had massacred the negotiatores who had sided with a rival to his power. But the biggest massacre of these guys came in Asia Minor around 88 BC. So a ruler called Mithridates from the kingdom of Pontus apparently organized a massive slaughter of Roman and Italian negotiatores and their families. And apparently our sources give wildly different numbers, but it seems like thousands of these people were murdered, apparently enthusiastically, by the local Greek communities, certainly at Pergamum and Ephesus, but also at other places. Cicero tells us that in addition to the bloodshed, this caused serious financial difficulties for a bunch of people back in Rome. So again, suggesting that these people are using funds, are investing funds on behalf of others back in Rome. Now, you might think that the relationship between negotiatores and Roman officials would be a little bit more positive, and probably it was. But political career was expensive around this time in ancient Rome. And so we do hear of Roman governors who try to profit from their local population of negotiatores. There's a surviving set of speeches about this guy named Gaius Verres. Cicero prosecutes him for corruption. And supposedly Verres once commented that to be successful in Roman politics, you needed to amass three fortunes. The first you'd use to bribe the voters to get elected. The second fortune you would use to bribe the jurors at your subsequent corruption trial. And then the third fortune would be the one that you would live on. Anyway, from Cicero's speeches, we learn about Verres' activities in Sicily. We hear that he had beheaded one negotiator and scourged another one. And these are Roman citizens who should not be treated that way. Roman citizenship should protect them from this sort of thing. In happier circumstances, we know that negotiators might serve on judicial boards in their particular provinces, dealing with disputes between Romans and the local population. And we also hear in North Africa of Roman generals relying on the local negotiatores to help them supply their armies during wars. Some negotiatores do follow Roman armies on campaign, and it does seem that in some cases, after completing their service, Roman soldiers would turn to this as an occupation. So while these men are Roman, they tend to live most of their lives elsewhere. The typical negotiator doesn't seem to come back to Rome very often. Perhaps periodically they will show up to, take part in the census. And supposedly a successful one would sort of stage a grand return, a readitus to the city, perhaps, showing off to everyone in the streets just how successful they'd been there. Despite being abroad, these men are able to take part in Roman politics. So to go back to North Africa, we know that Gaius Marius, who you see here, he'd been serving as a lieutenant in the war against Jugurtha, and he apparently got the negotiatores in North Africa to write back to their friends in Rome, urging them to support Marius as the new general in this war, and that in fact happens. Later on, when there was a failed conspiracy to overthrow the state in 63 BC, we hear that one of the conspirators, a man named Lentulus, had turned to a negotiator, that is Brennus here, to seek support back in his province, because it was thought that, a negotiator would know all the local leading men and could, facilitate some help there. They also serve as a kind of, network of information. So when Julius Caesar was misbehaving with a king, the king of Bithynia at one point, stories get back to Rome thanks to the negotiatores who were at this banquet and saw what he had gotten up to. All right, so of course, the Republic comes to an end starting in the 40s. Basically, the social and political tensions that had been growing in the second century are never really fully resolved, and we get a series of horrific civil wars, culminating, of course, in the war between Julius Caesar on the one hand and Pompey the Great on the other, seen here with their portraits on coins from the 40s. Negotiatores are caught up in this civil war as well. So we hear, for example, that so after Pompey was defeated in the Battle of Pharsalus, he ultimately fled to Alexandria. We hear that he stops in Cyprus and recruits various negotiatores to be in his, well, the new army that he desperately needs to raise. We also hear that the negotiatores in Antioch joined with the local inhabitants, a rare moment of agreement, to say they didn't want Pompey to go there. And they basically prevented him from showing up. Caesar later on will punish the negotiatores of Utica for having sided with basically other supporters of Pompey in North Africa. He fines them 200 million sesterces, which is a substantial sum of money, but not one that I can readily convert into dollars, sorry. But suffice it to say, that indicates that the negotiatores in Utica were doing quite well for themselves. After Caesar's assassination, we get several more civil wars, and things don't really calm down until the reign of Augustus, which starts around the year 30 BC. We enter the imperial period, and during this time, the meaning of the word negotiator starts to change. And by the 2nd century AD, the word just kind of means a wholesaler, a sort of large-scale trader in a particular commodity. And the word no longer implies any direct connection to Rome or even Roman citizenship. And it's often paired with an adjective to indicate the kind of negotiator that we're talking about. So we find grain merchants, basically, traders specializing in olive oil, wine, cloaks, clothes, ceramics, swords, salt, and so on and so forth. So it just kind of becomes a generic term for a large-scale trader in some commodity. Nevertheless, it's a occupation that potentially can get you some advantages in life, particularly if your business is involved in supplying the city of Rome with food, which is always a very important thing for the emperor and of course, for the residents of Rome themselves. So very early on, we hear the Emperor Claudius had reimbursed negotiatores who had shipped grain to Rome if they suffered any losses. So it's kind of a primitive insurance proposal. If you're engaged in shipping grain to Rome and something happens to your ships, the emperor will reimburse you. Later on, under Severus Alexander, we hear of further privileges granted, including the remission of taxes, again, for those who are operating at Rome or supplying Rome with food. We know that these traders also support the operations of Roman armies. And sometimes, again, that can be a jumping off point for a new career. So, for example, we have a inscription that tells us about a centurion and interpreter in a Roman army. Quintus Attilius Primus, who, after his military career, worked as a negotiator. And this is the latter half of the 2nd century. You could be also made not liable for public duties. This is another thing that we hear about. If you're helping the food supply of Rome, you would be exempt from munera, basically public duties that people are required to do. And those could be quite burdensome. So this is a very appealing privilege. There are women who appear as negotiatrices. For example, there is an Abudia Megiste, who was a negotiatrix of grain and legumes at Rome in the latter half of the 1st century AD. And I also wanted to mention that they, that is the negotiatores, sometimes formed associations, organizations of members that all pursue the same general occupation. And so we have some inscriptions that mention these organizations as well. And I suppose I should also mention that there's no reason to believe either of these two individuals in these portraits are actual negotiatores. This is pure window dressing here. So I mentioned at the beginning that our elite sources tend to be kind of uninterested in these, or is it disinterested? At any rate, they're rather hostile to people who engage in trade. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the reputation of the negotiator under the empire, and it's still rather negative. So I give you a couple of examples. Martial, the poet, complaining about this guy Vacra, insulting this guy Vacra, and it's interesting to note that in this list that includes slanderer, swindler, trainer of gladiators, apparently that's also bad. There is negotiator, so it's a pretty negative term. And then Jerome later on says, let poor men and strangers be acquainted with your modest table, and with them Christ shall be your guest. Avoid as you would the plague a clergyman who is also a negotiator, one who has risen from poverty to wealth, from obscurity to a high position. So there's a kind of general attitude that people who are successful through trading have just lied to a lot of people, deceived a lot of people, and are essentially kind of con men, if you will. All right. So my main idea here is that negotiatores are a class of Roman entrepreneur. And they're important because they provide us with a window into an important mechanism of Roman imperialism. They aren't conquering territory, but they are helping Roman armies in a number of instances we know to supply them. And I think it's worth mentioning that Rome wins its empire not because they have the greatest generals and the bravest soldiers. In fact, oftentimes they have profoundly incompetent generals. And to my mind, one of the main reasons for Roman success is, other than just sheer persistence, is their logistical ability. They're able to supply their armies and supply a new army when the last one has been slaughtered. And so negotiatores provide us with some interesting information, I hope, about how the Romans win and then profit from their empire. So, there's obviously the loot that soldiers and generals are acquiring from pillaging cities in conquered territory, but there's a longer term process of exploitation where the Romans take control of land and in the provinces and invest in it. And the negotiatores are funneling money from elite Romans into the provinces and making that one-time score of loot from Carthage or Corinth or wherever they've sacked into a consistent stream of revenue. And I think they deserve, some attention. Everybody knows, I think, about the publicans, the hated tax farmers in the empire. But the negociatores are part of the same process. They're just the private side of the coin there. Finally, I'll just mention that you might be wondering, aren't there any more kind of conventional entrepreneurs, like the sort of people that we tend to think of as entrepreneurs these days, people who, invent new things and form companies and become rich? Well, yes and no. Again, they're mentioned. Unfortunately, they're often mentioned in passing. So we hear about a guy named Gaius Sergius Orata, who became rich apparently because he invented hanging baths. I don't know what hanging baths are, but apparently they were very popular. And he also came up with new ways to create sort of artificial fish ponds and oyster beds to kind of feed the ravenous desire of the Romans for high quality seafood. But we really don't hear a whole lot about people like that. And there's nothing quite like the modern business as an independent entity. There are corporations. They tend to be short-lived. They don't extend beyond the lifetimes of the original members. There are even occasional references to shares and shareholders in mainly the tax farming corporations. But again, we don't hear about, I don't know, Caesar Corp or something like that. So it is rather frustrating to find these other more conventional, from our perspective, kinds of entrepreneurs. I'll end by just noting perhaps our best, most lengthy description of an entrepreneur is a fictional one. And he is a figure in the context of the work of satire. And I'm referring here to the main character in the only surviving lengthy fragment of Petronius's Satyricon. And that's a guy named Trimalchio. And the protagonists of this mostly lost novel have dinner with Trimalchio, and he's he's a ex-slave, and that's kind of gauche right there. But he's insanely wealthy, and he talks about his business activities, and that's gauche as well. And he doesn't know anything about high culture. He gets all the details about like the Trojan War wrong and stuff like that. And anyway, he's the object of laughter. But it is, I think, still an interesting depiction, and we can turn to his own words, and again, fictional words, as he describes his efforts to become wealthy. He says, "I conceived a passion for business. I built 5 ships, loaded them with a cargo of wine, and then it was very high in value, and I sent them to Rome. All the boats were wrecked. In one day, Neptune ate up 30 million sesterces. Do you think I lost heart? I swear this loss meant nothing to me. It was as if nothing had happened. I built a second fleet of ships, bigger, better, luckier ships, so that no one could say that I was not a brave man. I again loaded them with wine, bacon, beans, perfume, slaves. My wife sold all her gold and her clothes and placed the proceeds in my hands. What the gods wish for happens quickly. On one voyage, I rounded out 10 million sesterces. And I bought back the estates that my patron had owned. I bought slaves. I bought cattle. Whatever I touched grew like a honeycomb." But then he retires from business and just enjoys his great wealth, but then goes on to invest that wealth with his own freedmen, who are presumably carrying on this sort of activity of investing and trading and that sort of stuff. So anyway, while Trimalchio is a fictional character and he's being mocked, I think some glimpse perhaps of another perspective on trade and entrepreneurship comes through in this passage. And if our elite sources weren't particularly interested in this sort of behavior, other people in the Roman Empire were, and in some cases were quite proud of what they were accomplishing. Thank you again for coming, and I'm happy to answer some questions. Mike for Mike.
Is it on? Do I need to be on? Can I just be out? So you actually mentioned a bit at the end when you talked about Trimalchio being a former slave, but I was wondering what social class, or where, since other than being clearly not the elites, not the absolute elites, where are these negotiatores coming from? So they're ex-slaves, or they are small scale farmers who are using their land, getting doubled up by the aristocracy.
Yeah, they're all over the map. Cicero is most interested in the wealthiest ones who come from the equestrian order, which is those who are second in prestige to senators, but are often much wealthier than senators. But there are also much less wealthy, much less socially exalted negotiatores out there. And I think that a lot of them are likely to be ex-soldiers who see an opportunity and go with it. Sometimes they don't even they're pursuing business even before they've been discharged from the army. We hear about that from time to time. And also in many cases slaves and freed slaves of Romans. So slaves provided Romans with one tremendous advantage, well, actually more than one. So what you could do if you were owned slaves, you could give them some money, kind of an allowance or a capital sum, and allow them to go off and earn profit from it with limited supervision. And the deal was that if they earned X amount of money, they could buy their freedom from you. So they had an incentive to do well at their trading or whatever. But the other side of this was that the Roman slave owner, his liability was limited to the capital sum that he had provided. So if your slave went off and caused some sort of huge financial disaster, your personal slave owner's not going to be liable for the huge sums, just for whatever they had already decided was the amount that they were entrusting to this person. So another sort of form of insurance there. So yeah, I think slaves, and then because even if you're freed, you're never really completely free of your obligations to your former owner. A lot of the negotiatores may well be freed slaves who continued to pursue whatever occupation they'd been forced into during slavery. And certainly during the early empire, there does seem to be a lot of insanely wealthy former slaves running around Rome, just very lucrative, particularly if you happen to know the emperor. So yeah, they're not a particular social or economic class. They're all over the place.
I do have the mic working.
So as a group, do the negotiators disappear, or do they continue on through time up to, I don't know, Sicily, mafia?
I can't speak to the origins of the mafia. In fact, I'm not sure anyone's entirely sure. I've occasionally looked into that for one reason or another, but I don't think it stretches all the way back to antiquity. What I can say is that the negotiatores in the Republic are this distinct group of Romans and Italians who are not in Italy and are engaged in private work, usually, and then eventually it becomes just a generic term for maybe a more successful large scale trader under the empire. So the term changes its meaning. The people engaged in this activity lose their connection with Rome. They no longer are this important political bloc that they had once been. Yeah, I mean, there are always going to be traders, but the late Republican ones who had been, I think, quite important in tying the empire together economically, they kind of fade away ultimately.
Thank you, David. That was fascinating. The women you mentioned, any more on them? Are they the widows of, do we know?
I don't think we really know. What we tend to have for most of these people are, if they're not mentioned in Cicero or a historical text, and the ones mentioned in those texts are all men. Where we hear of women negotiatrices, they are from funerary inscriptions. And so what we get is, the name, who's setting up this funerary monument or gravestone or whatever, and oftentimes not a whole lot more than that. So yeah, there isn't much context for the women who are acting as traders. What I can tell you is that by the early Roman imperial period, so we're talking here 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Roman women have achieved a pretty high level of economic independence. So, I mean, they don't get to vote. They're still definitely second-class citizens in a bunch of ways, but they have a tremendous amount of economic independence, and there's no reason why they. Some of them are quite wealthy. There's no reason why they couldn't, engage in these activities, and indeed, it would make sense for them to be pursuing these sorts of opportunities, just as the Roman men are.
Thank you.
Yeah, really, really interesting. I'm thinking about this moment of you talk. So you describe, and I think this is more a late Republican than an imperial thing. It sounded almost like a promissory note, right? So there is this way in which that works, and so that got me thinking about logistics. So first, how does the note get from like way over there to Rome, and then also, how is it that how do you protect yourself against fraud? Like, how do you know that this note is actually going to yield this money and that this note actually indicates that your money was deposited and all that stuff?
Yeah, excellent question. So basically, you are relying on networks to pass along letters to friends and associates. We know that the tax farming corporations, and I'm using corporation in a very limited, not a modern sense there, but these are large operations to collect tax in the province. But we know that they had networks, and we know that they have large sums of money that they have collected in the provinces. So what you could do if you were, if you had connections, is you write a letter, you seal it, and you give it to some trusted associate. This might be a friend, it might be one of your slaves or a freed slave, and they're going to travel and deliver this message. And the idea is that the person receiving it trusts either the person giving it to them, or that person knows some other people who can vouch for them. And then the message says, please make available to my friend here or to some other party that I'm naming X amount of money. And I will, back here in Rome, deposit a sum of money in, with your banker or whatever. So yeah, it's there's definitely a potential for fraud. Definitely a potential for fraud there. But it is working mainly in terms of your connections. And there's certainly stories we hear of forgeries. And so I think there were some instances where people tried to trick those people into, giving them lots of money.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because it's like you can imagine a whole universe of like social trust and honor and obligation and all this stuff that would have to exist for this to even like, like it couldn't function in our society, right? So you have to think it's like a really different world there. And in that regard, I wonder, so the institution of slavery.
Before you go on to slavery, I just want to point you on the issue of friends, and relying on them. You might be interested in this book, which is all about friendship ties and patronage and how that works in the late Republic.
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah, because this is scholars of like early modern France, court life and things like that are also really interested in friendship because it's similarly like way more serious and important than what we would think of in the, in an aristocratic society.
Yeah.
So,
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and yeah, the Greeks and Romans are writing about friendship all the time. Oh, yeah, very, very important. And you shouldn't charge interest when you're loaning money to your friends. Is something they believe in somewhat, at least in theory. Sorry, but you had another question.
I was just wondering about the so in that context, I would imagine slavery would actually be a powerful form of, it's like delegation, right? Because this person, so you might not know this person, but this person is a slave of someone really powerful, and therefore you can draw certain conclusions, right?
Yep. Yeah. But yeah, instead of kind of modern corporations with employees, and our people like Cicero viewed any sort of job where you got a wage other than maybe being a soldier is equivalent to being a slave. Instead of companies with employees, you have the household, and the CEO is the paterfamilias, the eldest male in the family, and he is doing business through his slaves, through his freedmen, and is making investments that way. Just being sort of one, you don't want to personally be lending money at interest because that's demeaning, but it's fine if your slaves or your freedmen are doing that sort of stuff.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks.
Maybe I'm completely off on my years, but I remember seeing a program on Pompeii, and they showed like the main street, and they showed restaurants and bars and things that I would consider were businesses.
Yeah. But do we call, I don't know. I don't know if do we call the owner of a McDonald's franchise an entrepreneur? Maybe we do. But in which case, yeah, there are sort of small scale entrepreneurs in any Roman community running these restaurants, running inns, running all sorts of businesses. So yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that the only entrepreneurs were the negotiatores. I just wanted to sort of focus on them as a distinct class within the broader pool of entrepreneurs.
This is a relatively technical question, but and it has to do with late antiquity. So but since you mentioned that the change in the meaning of the word from the late Republican to the sort of early Imperial, how long do you have a sense of how long that meaning of sort of general large scale trader or merchant endured. I'm wondering if it endures all the way through the empire and even past until the massive imperial trade routes in the Mediterranean get severed.
Well, so I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but there is a reference to privileges for negotiatores in the digest. So presumably at the time of Justinian, there's still a class of people that are significant and important, hopefully.
Like in French, a négociant is a large scale wholesale dealer. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's kind of that meaning persists.
Right. No. Yeah, I just can't trace it through the medieval period. That's your job, Mike.
As far as I know, it does not exist as a term.
Hmm.
For merchants or something along those lines. It doesn't exist as a term. And so that's, yeah, I'm wondering if it's that very particular big scale of imperial trade that it's shattered and it's gone for several centuries.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when it comes back, they're no longer using negotiator. And I'm wondering if in the digest it's actually the Greek word or is it and it's back translated.
Right. Right. Yeah. I couldn't tell you that.
A last question from anyone?
Mine might be more like basic Roman economics, I guess, but these people seem to be more supplemental to the Roman economy. Like we help out in the frontier regions, or we bring in small goods, or is this like how was the Roman economy like set up? Was it mostly like state run, like all the industry for like producing wheat and that kind of stuff came from like the empire, or did it come from private people negotiating at the bottom level?
Okay, so it's a good question and one that's hard to answer in a straightforward manner because we don't have these sorts of data that we might like to have. So what I can say would be the economy is always overwhelmingly based on agriculture. But there does seem to be a dramatic increase in trade and long distance trade during the late Republic and into the early Empire. So in certain places like Rome and other major cities, some other professions become important. So, builders and the traders that I've been talking about are private individuals. That said, the empire plays a huge role in not so much managing the economy, because they don't seem to really think about that as a thing that they need to do necessarily, except with respect to prices of food at Rome. And there are occasional exceptions. But what I mean is that the taxation of the provinces and using those tax revenues in coin or in kind to buy things at Rome or wherever Roman armies stationed, that has a tremendous impact on the economy of the empire. But oftentimes the Romans are relying on private shippers to move the things from one place to another. So again, it's private enterprise, but you're being paid by the government. And there's one other kind of additional factor, and that is the personal property, the patrimony of the Roman emperor grows and grows. And the Roman emperor himself becomes this huge landowner with parcels of agricultural land, but also quarries and mines and other kinds of concerns all over the empire. And so that is sort of a distinct feature of the Roman economy and under the empire that is a little bit unusual. Yeah, so have I sort of answered your question, maybe? Okay.
I guess I was just thinking while you're talking about Rome, like there's a million people to feed. I just didn't know if there's like some central authority or some kind of gigantic like operation or monopoly even on like wheat and like creating the bread for the entire city or something like
Yeah, well, okay, if you make it a little bit more specific, I can give you a better answer. So
Apologies.
for the grain supply of Rome, you've got the Romans end up shipping in large quantities of grain annually from Sicily, North Africa, and most importantly from Egypt. Once they've taken Egypt, that grain is in such large quantities that it's likely that there are delivering more grain than is going to be distributed for free to those citizens who are entitled to free grain distributions. So it's the Roman state is likely selling the additional grain on the market, and that's having an impact on prices. But there are surely other people, local farmers, who are producing some grain, and they're also selling it on the market as well. So I couldn't tell you, what proportion of the grain going into Rome is just distributed rather than sold, and what proportion of the grain that's being sold is being sold by the state as opposed to private enterprise. But it's a pretty large proportion that the Roman state is personally bringing, or hiring people to bring and distributing. Okay, well, I guess that was the last question. So thank you again all for coming out tonight.